Okay, so welcome back to the third part of the parables. We're going to make sure that we cover all of them tonight, and then we'll be done with that. Now, just quick question: who remembers why the parables are being told? What is the purpose of the parables?
To hide the truth from the Jews and to teach the followers.
Correct, correct. So, because of the unpardonable sin, the Messianic kingdom had been rescinded, and so Jesus tells these parables. And remember, for the crowds, for those that haven't put their faith in him, they're going to be confused because they're just going to be stories without interpretation, and stories without interpretation don't mean anything. It's going to frustrate them. But in private, he then tells his disciples the meaning of the parables. And of course, the parables are all around the fifth facet of God's kingdom program. Remember, we talked about God's the five facets. He's got his universal kingdom, he's got his theocratic kingdom, right? He's got his spiritual kingdom, he's got the messianic kingdom. And then because of the unpardonable sin, the fifth aspect of God's kingdom program now gets introduced, and that is what is called, Jesus calls it the mysteries of the kingdom, which is why it's called the mystery kingdom. The other word that we said is a substitute for that, if it helps you out, is Christendom, right? Christendom, those who claim the name of Christ, whether they are true believers or not. And of course, we've seen Christianity become the largest religion in the world, and it's dominated for almost 2,000 years. So that's the idea of Christendom. So the purpose of these parables is that Christ now has to tell his disciples, what is this new thing? Because remember, Christendom or the mystery kingdom was not foretold in the Old Testament. You won't find it there. And because of that, that's why it's all a mystery. So now Jesus has to then help his disciples understand that what they thought was going to happen was the Messianic kingdom. What they thought was going to happen is they were going to rule and reign with him on earth is now not going to happen right now. It's now going to be replaced with something completely new that they don't know about. And so these parables are to help them understand the nature of this new thing. And so they're learning on the spot about this idea of the mystery kingdom. So we've already gone through several of the parables, right? And now we're going to finish off on that. We were interrupted, though. Remember last week, after Jesus has gone through several of his parables, he gets interrupted because his family, who has heard that he's out of his mind, he's crazy. Of course, that was the whole thing around the unpardonable sin and his confrontation with the Pharisees. They have come to rescue him, right? And so he's now telling these parables, and they've come, but because there's such a large crowd, they try to get to him, but they can't. They can't get to him. And so they send a messenger. They tell Jesus, hey, your family's here, your mother and your brothers are here. And then, of course, he says, who are my mother and brothers? These people, the ones that are my disciples, are basically my mother and my brothers. And so that's where we kind of ended off, is where he had repudiated essentially those earthly relations for himself in that moment. And now he's going to come back and finish up his parables. So remember, these parables are all in one sitting. They're all in one situation. He's just been interrupted, but he's going to come back. So tonight we're going to finish off those parables, and we're going to see how all of them put together give us some valuable information about the character of this mystery kingdom that now is being launched because of the rejection of the Jews to his messiahship. And the first one that we're going to cover today is going to be the parable of the hidden treasure, which is typically how it is termed. And of course, we will end up here with number 26 tonight, and then we'll be looking at his power, nature, and power of demons starting next week. Okay, so the parable of the hidden treasure. So this is what, again, he's just got done being interrupted, and he's got done talking about his family. Now he says, he gives another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field, which a man found and covered up. Then in his joy, he goes and sells all that he has and buys that field. Okay, short and sweet, right? So we've got a man, and in this scenario, there's a field, and when he's in this field, he somehow finds buried treasure. whether it's actual treasure or it's just something that he knows that he can mine out of the ground, whatever it is, it's more likely that he's found some treasure hidden by someone. But in order for him to obtain that treasure, he needs to buy the field because he needs to own the field in which the treasure is found, right? So that's what's going on. So this man discovers it, he covers it all up, and then he goes and he sells all that he has. That's important, right? The selling of everything that he has, this ultimate price the man can pay in order to purchase the field. And by purchasing the field, he therefore purchases the treasure. Okay? Oh, pretty clear, right? Now, in here, we've got some symbols. We've got treasure, field, and purchasing that treasure. Now, unfortunately, here's where the first parables that we've talked about, we're able to understand what they mean because Christ gave us the very first parable and said that was the key to unlocking the other ones. Well, they all made sense because they're all about seeds and soil and growing and tares and wheat. Like they're all part of the same kind of concept. So once you understood what the seed was, which is the gospel, you could then go to the other ones and interpret the symbolism there. Now we're going to run into a couple parables where, unfortunately, the first parable doesn't unlock anything, and neither do any of the other ones prior to it. They don't have any way to provide us information about what this means. Therefore, we have to go back to the Old Testament and look for symbolism in the Old Testament that might help understand. And so, because Christ is using this parable, he's going to use something that's going to be familiar to his hearers. And so the Old Testament is the place where we would go for that particular interpretation of the symbol, right? And the other problem that we have here is that not only are the symbols not part of the prior parables, but Christ doesn't interpret this, or at least we don't have the accounting in Scripture of what the interpretation is, unlike what he did with the other parables. So we have him giving the parable and explaining the meaning. Here he gives the parable. He might have explained the meaning to his disciples, but it was not recorded. So that leaves us with a little bit of work to do on these parables. Like, what is he trying to say? Now, again, I want you to keep in mind that what he's talking about is this new mystery kingdom. So whatever the parable is, and whatever the symbols represent, they're telling something about this new mystery kingdom. They're not just some random thing he's talking about. They're all in relationship to helping understand the mysteries of this new kingdom. I like what Louis Barbieri says about this, and he kind of nails it on the head, which is why people have difficulty with this parable. He says, since the Lord did not interpret this parable, a variety of interpretive views are held, and that is true. People try to come up with a lot of different things, just for the reasons why I just said. It can be hard to interpret. In the flow of this chapter, and I think he's right, in the flow of this chapter, and in the flow of what Jesus is conveying about this mystery kingdom, if we keep it within that context, some of those interpretive views don't work. And so I think he's spot on here where he says, in the flow of this chapter, it seems best to understand this, meaning the treasure, to be a reference to Israel, God's treasured possession. And he gives a couple examples, and we'll look at those in just a moment. One reason Jesus came into the world was to redeem Israel so that he could be viewed as the one who sold all he had, the glories of heaven and everything else, in order to purchase the treasure. All right. Now, there's a couple other reasons that we have for believing that in this parable, Israel is a treasure. And we have the reasons for believing the pearl of great price, which is the next one, actually is going to represent the Gentiles, both sides of believers within the kingdom that are both treasures and valuable. So we'll get to that in a moment. But when you think about the two sides of this coin, this treasure is the Jews, believing Jews. The opposite of the pearl of great price will be the Gentiles. And I'll give you some reasons for actually thinking that's the best interpretation for the parable. Okay, so if we don't have the symbolism within the New Testament up to this point, we don't have the symbolism within the parables that have been told, we have to reach back to the Old Testament to figure that out, because he's using symbolism that he expects his readers to at least have some attachment to. When we go back to the Old Testament, we do find treasure used in symbolic terms, and when it's used in the symbolic terms, it references the nation of Israel. So here's some examples. Exodus 19, 5-6. Now, therefore, if you indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, You shall be my treasured possession among all peoples, for all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the people of Israel. So there they are. Israel is referenced as God's treasured possession. Deuteronomy 14:2, for you are a holy people to the Lord your God, and the Lord has chosen you to be a people for his treasured possession out of all the peoples who are on the face of the earth. And then Psalm 135, for the Lord has chosen Jacob for himself, Israel as his own possession. So when we have this symbolic use of treasure, it references the nation of Israel, which is where I'm going to land on the meaning of this. And it actually makes sense within the context of describing the mystery kingdom. This is the Jews, and the pearl of great price will then be the Gentiles. All right. So Israel as symbolized by treasure, then what's the point here? What's he telling? Because it's a very short parable, not much to it. Well, I'll have them right up here. First of all, most of the nation is going to reject him, right? There's a field, and this field is wide, but in one part of the field, a section of the field is where the treasure is found. All right, so the nation as a whole reflects the field, but there's going to be a small remnant, a very small portion of that in which that treasure is actually going to be found. God then will do the most extreme thing he can do in order to provide salvation, in order to redeem that treasure. And that, of course, was through the Messiah's own death. And of course, when we go back to what it says, here it says that he goes and he sells all that he has to buy the field. And again, Christ uses those words because he wants people to understand that this is the ultimate sacrifice the person could do in order to obtain that possession. And then the point here then would be that God's going to gain from the Jews, a remnant, a believing remnant of people that are going to be his own possession and treasure from the nation at large. And we know that this is what the New Testament teaches then, because the New Testament teaches that, well, God's chosen people are the Jews in a sense of they're chosen as a racial group, as a national group that he has as his chosen people. Only those within it, though, are going to receive that salvation, that are believers, right? And we see that from the New Testament. Just a couple places where this idea of a remnant from within the nation is in Romans chapter 11, 1 through 5, and Galatians chapter 6, 11 through 16. So in Romans 11, 1, it says, I ask then, and this is Paul, he says, I ask then, has God rejected his people? So if you go back to Romans 9 and 10, you'll kind of see the context for this question. Because of what he said in 9 and 10, has God thrown off the Jewish people? Are they no longer his people anymore? Right? That's the question. And has God rejected his people? Paul says, by no means, or God forbid, for I myself am an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham, a member of the tribe of Benjamin. God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew. Do you not know that the scripture says of Elijah how he appeals to God against Israel? Lord, they have killed your prophets, they have demolished your altars, and I alone am left, and they seek my life. But what is God's reply to him? I have kept for myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to Baal. So too at the present time there is a remnant chosen by grace. And that's Paul's response. Yes, though most of the Jews have rejected Christ. And it could be easy to say, like, well, there we go, God's forgotten them. I mean, you know what, let's go to the Gentiles now because the Jews are all washed up. God's done with them. Paul says, no. God has not rejected the Jews, because within that, the Jewish nation, there is a remnant, albeit maybe small, that are believers in Jesus as the Messiah. Paul then goes on in Galatians chapter 6, 11 through 16, where he says, see with what large letters I am writing to you with my own hand. It is those who want to make a good showing in the flesh who would force you to be circumcised, and only in order that they may not be persecuted for the cross of Christ. He's talking about Jewish believers that are trying to make the Gentile believers be circumcised, right? For even those who are circumcised do not themselves keep the law, but they desire to have you circumcised that they may boast in your flesh. But But far be it from me to boast, except in the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ, by which the world has been crucified to me, and I to the world. For neither circumcision counts for anything, nor uncircumcision, but a new creation. And as for all who walk by this rule, peace and mercy be upon them and upon the Israel of God. Now, no, Mike, I know that you brought this verse up a couple of weeks ago, and I told you that we'd get to it, to hang on. But and I don't want to go into the details here, but notice that he says, nothing counts except for a new creation. So the new creation are obviously believers. But notice how he ends verse 16. And as for all who walk by this rule, peace and mercy be upon them. Okay, well, those are believers. But now he says, and upon the Israel of God. Well, the Israel of God are the Jews. Those are the Jewish believers. That's Paul's way to designate them, either calling them a remnant or calling them the Israel of God, because in that way he defines them not just as Jews only, but as Jews who are believers. And so you have one group, the first one, mercy be upon them, that's the Gentiles, and upon the Israel of God. So this idea then of God ransoming and finding this treasure and giving all he has so that he can redeem them is a reference to Israel, right? So within the meaning of the parable then is within this idea of Christendom, it's going to have both Jews and Gentiles, right? He's already talked about there's going to be believers and unbelievers. Now his point here is that it's going to be made up of, in this case, Jews. And now the next parable he's going to give us is going to tell us that it's going to be about Gentiles. It's going to be comprised of Jews and Gentiles who put their faith and trust in Christ as the Messiah. Now, before I go on to the pearl of great price, let me stop and ask if there are any questions about the treasure. Hold on just a sec here.
I have one question. If you can go back to where you had the 3 verses, the third was a psalm mentioning Jacob.
Yep.
Right there. So I'm going through read through the Bible in a year, and I just happened to be on Jacob and Esau right now. And my intention was after class to ask you this question, but it seems pertinent at this point, so I'll ask it. I don't get why Jacob was in God's favor, because he tricked his brother into his birthright, and then he put on a hairy arm and tricked his father to get his father's blessing. And then Jacob ends up with the blessing and God's blessing and sees the ladder and all of that. And it's like, I mean, I can accept it because he's God. He can do whatever he wants. But I'm just curious what your take on that point is.
So I said that the first thing to remember is that God chose Jacob over Esau at what point in history for his birth? So and my point is that I actually chose him in eternity past and be the right way, because God always knew. But from a human perspective, we know from the biblical account that Jacob was chosen over Esau in the womb before the birth. Okay. So in other words, before either one of them had done anything to merit God's favor, to then put them in better standing with God so he would choose them, God already made the selection. And that's actually Paul's point. Paul's point in Romans is the very same thing. Like, there isn't anything that they did where God said, you're a really good person and you're a horrible person, therefore I choose you. Before God has made that decision, right? To make that choice, and it's God's choice, his sovereign choice to do it. So we know that the choice was made before there were any action taken by any individual to make them stand out. But again, the second thing to say is that, remember, it's not our actions that put us in right standing with God. That's the whole point. That's right. And that's what Paul says in Romans chapter 4, that it's faith. If you take a look at Abraham, Abraham lied. Like Abraham was, there were certain things that Abraham did that you look and go, that is not okay. He was faithless many times. He didn't think God could protect him, even though God promised him. So he would lie so that he wouldn't die because of Sarah. So he lied a couple times. He almost got a king killed for the king not doing anything wrong. I mean, so you take a look at Abraham's actions. He did some stuff that wasn't good, but yet God still chose him, right? Same thing with Jacob. Jacob did some stuff that he shouldn't done. Same thing with David. Like you go down the list, and that's Paul's whole point. In fact, I think it's Romans chapter 3, where he refers back to David, where David talks about God's grace and mercy in spite of our actions, right? So that's how I'd answer that one. There is that their actions within life had nothing to do with God's choice of that individual of one over the other. And in fact, Paul even says, Jacob I loved and Esau I hated. Now, hated there doesn't mean like he's angry at him. Hated means I chose Jacob and I didn't choose Esau. So clearly this was just a choice that God made and without regard to their future action. Rich, hold on just a second here. Let me get to you here. Hold on just a sec here. Up.
Didn't Esau do something, make a choice to give up his birthright?
Oh, he did.
I'm thinking of
Yeah.
a bowl of stew or something like
he
that.
did. He did. I mean, here's the thing. We
So-
can look at it and say, and I could have mentioned that as well, but
Yeah.
here's the thing. Esau willingly gave that up for a bowl of porridge or soup. However, the other point is still that he was deceived. That it wasn't Esau that was deceived. Who was deceived? So Esau wasn't deceived. Esau gave up his birthright
Right.
by choice. Who did Jacob deceive?
His father.
His father. Who's his father? Isaac. So the thing is just because Jacob, because Esau gave his bowl, you've still got Jacob over here deceiving his father Isaac, right? So there's still an act of deception. It just wasn't against Esau. That's the point. Okay. Yeah. Oh.
So in the parable, and the treasure's hidden in the field, man found it, he hid it again. Is there any significance to him hiding it again? Is that like, why, if it's treasure, why would you want to prevent other people from finding?
I don't think it's actually pertinent to what Jesus's point is. However, I do think that Jesus provides the answer as to why he would hide it. And that is because if he finds treasure in someone else's field and the person knows that treasure's there, then it's stealing, right? So in order for you to actually have ownership of that, you need to own the field. So his whole purpose is, I'm going to hide this away and I'm going to go purchase the field so that whatever is found in the field now belongs to me. I think it's more of a legal thing. I don't think it has a bearing necessarily on the outcome of the parable, but I think that's why he says that.
So you're not trying to hide it from the field to prevent him wanting to sell it to you.
Well, I mean, anytime you say you're going to hide something, there's always a reason why you're certainly intentionally trying to make sure others don't find out. But I don't think that plays into the character, because in this case, the person that sells all that he has is God or Jesus with the death that he has on the cross. So I wouldn't impute any bad character. But I think it's just more of a transactional thing. If I find something there, I need to buy the field because then I have ownership of that. Would be the reason for that.
Randy, I got a quick question.
Yeah, Mike.
The parables were to hide the truth from the Jews and to teach the disciples. You had mentioned that the parables also explain the mystery kingdom. So all the parables are specifically towards the mystery kingdom. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Yes, correct. In fact,
Thank you.
we'll get to, I'll wrap them all up here at the end of the evening so we can see how they all kind of flow in order and how they describe the nature of the kingdom.
Yeah.
All right, so let's go on to the next one, which is the parable of great price. And again, since these follow one right after another and they have a very similar concept, we need to understand that Christ is trying to tell us something, but he doesn't just want to tell you the same thing, because then why tell the second parable? So while the nature of the parables might be very similar, there's got to be something different about it, which is why I think the first one is about Israel because of the symbolism of the Old Testament. And this other one is going to be about the believing Gentiles.
Is there a significance to the order of these?
I don't think there's, I don't know. I mean, I don't know that there's any significance, but I do think, sorry, let me back that up. I think there's a significance in the fact that the parables are put together, one right after another, but whether or not you couldn't have done them great price, the pearl great price first, and then the other one. I don't know, but I do think maybe biblically there is, because Paul says in Romans chapter 1:16, for I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for it's the power of God for salvation to the Jew first,
Jews first.
and then to the Gentiles, or then to the Greeks. So just from a biblical order of the gospel going out and of the redemption process, and in fact, even if you think about actual history, the first people that were saved were from the death of Christ were whom? I'm not talking about in the Old Testament. I'm talking about after the Christ was died and resurrected, who were the first believers in his resurrection? Jews. So that there could actually be I had never thought about that, Rich, and you might be right. There might be a more intentional purpose in the order than what I'd actually originally thought. So good question.
These are all spoken by Christ.
Yeah, these are all spoken. He's sitting around, because he always sits when he's teaching, right? Never stands. He's always sitting when he teaches. And he's telling them all these parables, and these are all verbal parables, right? Okay, so he goes on to the next one, right? So one parable right after another. He says, again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant in search of fine pearls, who, on finding one pearl of great value, went and sold all that he had and bought it. Now, again, notice that what we have here is we've got a person. Now he's searching for, in this case, fine pearls. So, the other one was treasure. This is fine pearls. And when he finds the pearl of great price, then he goes and sells all that he has to buy it. Well, it's almost the exact same identical thing we just saw. The other person found this treasure in a field, went and sold all that he had to buy the field, and therefore he came into possession of treasure. This guy searching for the pearl, he finds a pearl of great price, sells everything he has so he can buy it. So the concept between these two is identical. So we have to ask ourselves then, why tell a parable that seems to say the exact same thing? You're just using pearl instead of treasure. Well, again, because treasure would refer to the Jews, the pearl of great price is going to refer to the Gentiles. Now we have some pretty decent reasons for believing that this one is focused on the Gentiles, which therefore would mean the opposite side of the coin is the one before would be focused on the Jews. Now, again, Louis Barbieri says this. He continues to go on. He says, this parable, again, also not interpreted by the Lord, which again makes these two kind of difficult, because he just gives the parable, doesn't explain it, may be linked to the previous one. The pearl of great value may represent the church, the bride of Christ, the bride of Jesus. Pearls are uniquely formed. Its formation occurs because of an irritation in the tender side of an oyster. There is a sense in which the church was formed out of the wounds of Christ and has been made possible by his death and sacrifice. The merchant who sold everything he had in order to buy the highly valued pearl represents Jesus Christ, who through his death provided redemption for those who believe. These two parables in close proximity, the treasure and the pearl, teach that within the period of time when the king is absent, Israel would continue to exist and the church would be growing. Now, I don't agree with him necessarily on this. The reason why I included the point here is that I do think he is right that it's linked with the previous one, right? And that he does draw out that he sees that there is Israel in the church. Now, where I would differ from him here is that in the first one, the treasure that he has found would be believing Jews. And the second one, well, he recognizes that, yes, this would refer to Gentiles, that it's the believing Gentiles to make up the church. These two parables together are to describe the body of Christ, instead of this one just being representing the church. And I don't think it really makes sense to hold completely to his view here, because if the first parable was about Israel and those are God's treasure, well, he hasn't redeemed them yet if they're not believers. So it wouldn't make I don't think that makes sense. So I differ with him on his interpretation, but I see exactly where he's going with a connection of one parable right after another, basically saying the exact same identical thing. All right. Why should we believe, though? We understand there's some reasons symbolically to look at treasure as being referring to Israel in the first one. Why would we think a pearl would represent the Gentiles, believing Gentiles in the second one? Do we have any reasons for that? And I think we actually do. First of all, the pearl comes from the sea. And if you read the Old Testament, you'll find out that the sea represents the Gentile nations, right? Particularly when you're talking prophetically, the sea is almost always a symbol of Gentile nations. right? So for instance, in Daniel chapter 7, verse 2-3, it says, Daniel declared, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the four winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea, and four great beasts came up out of the sea, different from one another. Well, we know those four great beasts are the four Gentile empires, right? Babylon, Medes and Persians, right? The Greeks and the Romans. And so it's out of the sea. And this is just one instance where the symbolism for sea is regarding Gentiles. We have in Revelation 17, 1-2 and 15, it says this, then one of the seven angels who had seven bowls came and said to me, come, I will show you the judgment of the great prostitute who is seated on many waters, with whom many of the kings of the earth have committed sexual immorality, and with the wine of whose sexual immorality the dwellers on earth have become drunk. And the angel said to me, the waters that you saw where the prostitute is seated are peoples and multitudes and nations and languages. So this is a way of describing the Gentile nations. And so very frequently you're going to see the sea or the waters representing the Gentile nations, right? The other thing is that why this actually, I think, would make sense is, under the Mosaic law, the oyster was unclean, right? You couldn't eat the oyster or anything like that. Under the law of the Messiah, that's now been rendered clean. And so what you have here is this oyster would be representative of the cleanness now that has come because of Christ. So I think in general, even though Christ doesn't interpret it, it seems to make the most sense out of what he's trying to convey, which is there are two treasures that he is redeeming as part of this mystery kingdom, right? And we know biblically that those two treasures are believing Jews and believing Gentiles that make up the body of Christ. So it seems to make the most sense that he wasn't just telling a redundant parable, because I don't think Christ ever does anything just to be redundant like that, but that he's actually implying that these two treasures represent those two groups. And it seems to make, to me, the most sense, right? Now, if that's correct, then the interpretation that we have here of the pearl of great price is, number one, that salvation is not only going to be given to the Jews, but also to the Gentiles, because the prior parable of the treasure is about Jews. He's also going to say, but we've got this other pearl of great price. So it's not just going to be exclusive to the Jews. And in fact, this was a very hot topic in the early church. There was a question about whether or not Gentiles could even be believers and be saved, right? And if they could, if someone would grant that they could, then they had to become Jews, essentially. I mean, that was the whole, you read the epistles and stuff, like really hot topic here, and Christ is laying the groundwork for that's not going to be the case. The other thing is that the nature of an oyster is that it's built over like a little piece of sand that gets inside there, and then there's the calcium deposits that get deposited over and over again over a large period of time that then result in the creation of the pearl. So this is a process that continues and continues, and the more it continues, the more and more and more it grows. And we see within the Gentiles within the church, initially they were very small, right? For the first part, there weren't any Gentiles. It was all Jews that were believers. And then you start getting the Apostle Paul going out, right? And others on these missionary journeys, and all of a sudden you get slow and slow and slow but sure, and before you know it, that has now become, the Gentiles are the greatest component of the body of Christ at this moment in history, right? We see some of these ideas here, and these are just a few. We could actually, if we took this concept of the Gentiles and why the Gentiles now have become, over a period of time, this massive part of the body of Christ, we could kind of take that concept and delve into it a lot more. But here's a couple verses for you to kind of keep in mind. In Acts chapter 15, 14 through 18, remember the discussion in Acts chapter 15 is basically, can these Gentiles be Christians? And if they can be, do they have to become Jews, right? Do they have to be circumcised? Do they have to do all of this stuff? And Paul is like, no, Like this is not okay. They don't have to do this. They're Gentiles. So there's this big council, big argument in the church that was finally resolved in Acts chapter 15, which was basically Gentiles had to abstain from sexual immorality and things that were sacrificed to idols or blood, right? So those are the two stipulations, but none of the other things that were part of Mosaic law or part of the Jewish identity were to be put on the Gentiles. So anyway, in Acts chapter 15, this is what it says. Simeon has related how God first visited the Gentiles to take from them a people for his name. And with this, the words of the prophets agree, just as it is written, after this I will return, and I will rebuild the tent of David that has fallen. I will rebuild its ruins, and I will restore it, that the remnant, remember this is, again, remnant now refers to the believing Jews of mankind may seek the remnant of mankind may seek the Lord, and all the Gentiles who are called by my name, says the Lord, who makes these things known from of old, right? So he's talking about this process here where Gentiles are also going to be called by his name, will also be part of this fold. And then in Romans 11:25, it says, lest you be wise in your own sight, I do not want you to be aware of this mystery, brothers. A partial hardening has come upon Israel. Okay, and that hardening is because of because of God, because of the rejection of the nation, right? A partial hardening. Now look at it, partial, not full, right? So not all the Jews have rejected him, has come upon Israel. Now, how long will that hardening last? Now, the reason why I ask this question is this. I've had many of you over and over again ask me, why don't the Jews, the majority of Jews, believe in Christ? Well, we can give you all kinds of reasons. I can give all kinds of actual reasons why they can and should in many cases, how they've been treated by Christians, the Holocaust. We could go on and on and on, but really the biblical reason is right here. They've rejected Christ, therefore God has given them a partial hardening. And how long does that hardening last? Until the fullness of the Gentiles. And the fullness of the Gentiles, if we were to go back, the fullness of the Gentiles is an eschatological concept where those four beasts that we saw coming up out of the sea in Daniel, those represent the times of the Gentiles. And so until that fourth kingdom of the Gentiles is done, and until God has removed from the Gentiles as many believers as are going to put faith and trust in him, however you think of that theologically, once as many Gentiles has come to faith, God is going to close out that time of the Gentiles. Then there's going to be this tribulation period, and then Israel is going to confess their faith in him, and then there's going to be the Messianic kingdom. So this blindness that we see upon the Jews is already known. Paul's already explained it, and we've already seen it in the life of Christ. So while it may not explain the individual decision of a specific Jew today, in general, this is a hardening of the Jews to the acceptance of Jesus the Messiah. It will continue on until the time of the Gentiles ends, right? And I hope that time of the Gentiles is pretty soon. Be kind of nice. But anyway, that's
Fourth kingdom. That fourth kingdom?
fourth kingdom, yes.
That one happened yet?
It is. It's happening. It was inaugurated with the Roman Empire. Yeah, and if we were to get into eschatology, we could talk about that fourth kingdom and how that fourth kingdom is still continuing to this day. But that is a way off top.
Another time?
Another year and a half. Another year and a half question. Yeah. All right. Okay. Okay, let me pause and ask if there's any questions about that parable before we go into the parable of the net. Then we've got the parable of the householder, and then we've got kind of a wrap up for tonight. So we got two more parables, but any questions on those two?
Well, I have a question, but it's kind of off. It's a little.
Okay, well, we'll save, yeah.
You gave us an assignment to look at the prodigal son.
Okay, well, when we're done here, after we're all done for tonight.
Any connection to any of these parables?
No,
None?
no, no.
None?
No, that's not the purpose of it. No. And remember, these parables, so Jesus will tell future parables. Those future parables don't necessarily relate or have to relate to the mystery kingdom. the purpose of these parables that we have here, that we've been studying over the past 3 weeks, contained within this, these parables are all related to explaining the mystery kingdom. That's why Jesus says, here, to you has been given the mysteries of the kingdom. And he goes on to explain these parables. Future parables will actually make other theological points, and that one is not one. But we can talk about what it is when we're done tonight. Yeah. But go back. If you read if you read back before the parable, then make sure you read the context before don't just start with the parable, read before it, because that's the issue being addressed in the parable of the prodigal son. You got to go back and read beforehand. Okay, let's talk about the parable of the net. I did. In fact, you go on to that. I did. I actually did. It's on tape. I said, you've got to go back, because every parable is told because there is a question to be asked or a theological point to be made. And what you must do is you must read what's the question or what's the theological point that the parable answers. Yeah. Yeah. So now go back, Rich. Oh, okay. Okay. Now the parable of the net. Matthew chapter 13, again, going on from what he's just left off with. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a net that is thrown into the sea and gathered fish of every kind. When it was full, men drew to shore and sat down and sorted the good into containers, but threw away the bad. So it will be at the end of the age. The angels will come out and separate the evil from the righteous and throw them into the fiery furnace. In that place, there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So what we have here is very similar and almost identical to the parable of the tares. Now, remember, in the parable of the tares, you had a farmer that sows good wheat, and in the middle of the night, his enemy comes and seeds his fields with these weeds, and then starts to grow up, and his servants come in and says, "Hey, master, didn't you plant good seed like wheat?" And he goes, "Yes." He goes, "Well, there's all these tares growing up. There's all these weeds growing up." And then he says, "Well, the enemy must have done that." And then his servants say, should we go out and rip out the tares and save the wheat?" And he says, "No, no, no, no. Wait until the very end, until they're full grown. And then when we've harvested the whole thing, then we'll separate them. These are going to get, the tares will get thrown into a bundle and thrown into the fiery furnace to be destroyed and burned up. These other ones will be taken in the barn, which was the kingdom." So that was the parable of the tares. Now we have one that sounds very similar. He is making a slightly nuanced point with this one that's different than the other. So we do have certain things like a net was thrown into the sea and gathered fish of every kind. All right. And again, if we remember here now, the sea is representative of who? Gentiles. Okay, so now we have actually some connection to the parable of the great price. So now we actually have this being a discussion about, Gentiles in general. Okay, we do have the same concept of they've got a net that's thrown in and pulled up, which is basically the same as in the tares, where you allow the wheat and the tares to grow up together. You put the sickle in and you gather that all in. So this net being gathered up is sort of that same concept. But of course, within the net, as well as within the wheat and tares, you have the good and the bad, right? So that part is consistent between the two parables, right? So you've got some that are thrown into good into containers, but then you threw away the bad. Now, again, if you go back to the tares, this part right here is basically the same thing. At the end of the age, the angels are going to come and they're going to separate out the evil, in this case, specifically Gentiles, from the righteous Gentiles, throw them into the fiery furnace. In that place, there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth, which is what we heard before. Now, we are going to get fairly soon, within a month or two, probably 2 months, we're going to get into the doctrine of hell. We're going to take a little excursus into that topic. But this is what he's referencing here. He's referring to the fiery furnace, and there's weeping, and there's going to be gnashing of teeth. So again, that little bit of the nuance there is that a fact that this is now referring to those Gentiles. And then when we get to later on in Matthew chapter 25, we're actually going to see some eschatology played out where Christ sort of references something very, very similar. And I've given you the reference for that, 25, 30 through 46. I'll kind of leave it there for you to kind of ponder until we get there. So what we have here is now there's going to be these Gentiles that are going to be hauled in, and then there's going to be a final judgment of them. Okay. Parable of the net. What questions do you have? I know we're kind of going bang, 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 but they're all, you know, you got suckers and salmon. That's right. Yeah, way to look at it. You got suckers and salmon. You throw one away and you eat the other.
But just simply about the separation of not just non-believers and believers, but specifically believing and non-believing Gentiles.
Correct. That's the nuance on this one, is that it's now not just talking about mankind in general. It's talking about that now. And when we get to just a little sneak peek here, you're going to find out in Matthew, the end of Matthew, when Christ starts talking about eschatology, he's going to talk about the Gentiles and what the Gentiles do. In this case, it'll be very specific what he'll talk about, but what they're going to do during the tribulation. Do they support the Jews or do they not? And it's because of what they do that they'll be separated out into the basically the sheep and the goats, right? What you did and didn't do. So it's their actions. It's going to be directed specifically the Gentiles, what you did in relationship to Israel during that time. Again, there's a lot to unpack there, but essentially he's setting that up right now to show that within this mystery kind of kingdom period, that the Gentiles, there's going to be good and there's going to be righteous Gentiles and unrighteous Gentiles, and there will be a final judgment, as well as the righteous Gentiles will now be included in the kingdom, right? So that's important for us to hear, that it's not just, you know, Jews that you've got the righteous and unrighteous, but now Gentiles are also included in that the final kingdom program.
I know we're all judged individually, but in this context, is he referring to Gentile nations?
No. It's going to be, these are individuals. Yeah, these are individuals. Just like there's individual stocks, there's individual fish right there. But you have them, as I'm picking out one fish as an individual, that's going to either be thrown into the pot to get tossed away into the dump, or it's going to be, you know, kept in the boat and eaten for dinner. Yeah. Okay, we've got our last one here, which is the parable of the householder. And again, these ones that we're covering tonight are actually a little more difficult, because unlike the first ones we covered, where Jesus actually interprets them, he doesn't do interpretation for these. And so we're really left to think through it, and that makes it quite a bit more difficult on all of these, but hopefully we're wisely making our way through that interpretation. Okay, the parable of the householder. Okay, so Christ has told all of these, and he asked a really funny question. I mean, it's not funny, but it seems funny to me because of their response. Their response, looking back at it historically, is pretty laughable. But this is what he says. Have you understood all these things? So he's told all these parables. You got it? You got it?
Absolutely.
Totally, right? Totally. Yeah, everything you made sense was fine. It's made me hungry. You've talked about wheat, which turns into bread, and you've talked about fish. So when are we going to eat? Like, that's what he says. Have you understood all these things? And they said to him, yes. And he said to them, therefore, okay, because you've understood everything, every scribe who has been trained for the kingdom of heaven, okay, so in other words, the scribes, these people, these learned people, if you have been trained for that, if you've understood everything, all of you now that are being trained for the kingdom of heaven is like a master of a house who brings out his treasure, what is new and what is old. All right, what in the world are you talking about? Like, he just got done asking if we understood, and then he gives this other thing about, okay, so therefore, now that you've understood everything, now you're like a person who now has treasure in his house. And inside your house, you've got some newly acquired treasure, and you've got some old treasure you've had for a while, and you bring it out of your house. Like, what in the world are you talking about? Kind of, except for he's not selling it. He's actually just, he's got this, and he's just brings it out of his house, a treasure, and he's got it there. Now, so now what we're left with is we understand the idea of treasure, because we've been talking about treasure and we've been talking about the pearl and everything else. We understand that that's going to represent, you know, these believers and stuff that we have. But now he's going to take out this new and what is old. Now, there's a couple ways and ways to sort of look at this. They might all be right, because I don't know that it's as clear cut exactly what he's saying here. But let me kind of give you what I think. And there's actually kind of a little nuance that I didn't put in here that I think might apply as well. Now, again, really interesting. They say, yes, they understand. But then when you take a look at their actions almost immediately, like they don't understand anything at all. So this gives a, you know, if the disciples are kind of us, we put ourselves in their shoes, we're like that most of the time. We think we know exactly what God's doing. We think we know exactly how he operates. We think we know, you know, we've got him well understood. And then we go around and we act like idiots. And it's clear we haven't understood anything, right? And we do that all the time. They're in the same boat. And so you look at it and go, yeah, they're nodding this way, but they are not like, and you can just see Jesus, he's probably watching them nod. And I don't know, maybe he's got a little smile on his face, like, you know, I don't know, really? Yeah. Sometimes it's like sometimes it's like when you ask your kid, do you understand? And they say, yeah. And you're like, we'll see. We'll see. That's right. That's right. That's right. Just give us something to eat. All right. Okay. So again, we've got some symbols that are kind of there, but we have this new thing of old and new that hasn't been brought up before. So Jesus must be now focusing on this aspect. What do we think about the old and the new, right? Now, I don't think I have this on here, but I'll kind of go into that in just a moment here. But I do like what Fruchtenbaum says on this. He says the ninth parable is the parable of the householder, which teaches that some aspects of the mystery kingdom have similarities with other facets of God's kingdom program. Other aspects are brand new and never be found before. They emphasize the mystery character of the facet of God's kingdom program. True, and I think that's certainly probably right, or close to right, or at least one possible explanation of that. That what Jesus is saying here is that there's going to be some new things and some old things, and it's because of that newness, oldness thing that it creates a mystery, and that's why it's hard to understand this. Like there's going to be some things that are going to come out in this mystery kingdom. Some things will be like the prior kingdoms, facets that have happened, and some will be new. And so it's the newness aspect that becomes hard to understand. And actually the interplay between the similarities between them is going to be hard to understand. Like this mystery kingdom is going to take a while to flesh itself out, to be understood. And certainly it'll take the disciples a long, long time before they actually have a decent grasp of what that is. So I do think that is a good explanation, possible explanation. I do also think, and I think this is maybe just as likely, that what he's emphasizing here is the old and new refers to the old and the new covenant, right? So that there's a difference here between this sort of melding of, not melding of, but there's going to be aspects of, particularly for Jewish believers, that they may hold on to, not as a form of salvation or anything else, but they're going to be holding on to some of that stuff. Because you look in the New Testament, part of the friction between them is, you know, you either got the Jews are like, you Gentiles got to be Jews to be believers. And the Gentiles are like, we don't want to do that. We're Gentiles. And, you know, we just want to believe in Christ. And so there's sort of this old and this new that in some mysterious way, it's got to work its way out. And there's some of that tension. And that tension has continued to exist within the church, even currently. There are Jewish believers and Gentile believers that sometimes don't quite see eye to eye on some of that stuff. And so there's some of this friction. So I think another possibility is that this new kingdom is going to have some of those elements, and that's going to be part of what is expressed within that. So I think Arnold is perfectly fine in that, and I think he's probably absolutely right. But there could also be, as some have recognized, that there is a combining of Jews and Gentiles here. There's an old and a new that have to get combined into this new sort of entity, this new body. And that's something that wasn't really thought of. Because in the Old Testament, if you were a Gentile and you want to become, you know, you wanted to live in Israel, you wanted to become that, you had to be a Jew. You had to adopt that. You had to obey the Mosaic law, You know, you had to basically become that. And so this mystery kingdom is going to be different. It's not going to be that thing. There's going to be an old and a new. So I think that's also a possible thing that he is expressing. Again, not sure if I'm right or not, but we'll see. Okay, so before I go on to that, any questions about this parable? Okay,
So can I ask a question on that about that specific?
yeah, you can. Do you
All
want to?
Here's the Philippian law.
Says that a summary, and I don't know if you're gonna get into that.
I am.
The summary,
Yeah.
that in the summary of the 9 parables, it allows one to see the movement of the mystery kingdom
Mm.
from start to finish. So that would indicate to me that the order of these could mean something from start to finish.
Yeah, and I don't know that he's thinking, I know exactly what you're talking about. I don't think he's necessarily thinking that it shows the kingdom chronologically expanding necessarily, but I think he's looking at that from a, um, a,
Well, is it,
I-
is it he says, he calls it the movement of the,
that's right. I think
Of
he's
the
talking about the
mystery kingdom.
idea, and I'll get into that. So
because the
you-
mystery kingdom ends at some point.
it ends with the messianic kingdom.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So, but I don't think he's talking about that there's these are chronologically, like this parable happens and then like in time, this next one happens. And so he's not talking about it advancing in a chronological way. He's talking, all these parables are going to happen, you know, intermixed around, some of them around the same time, but certainly all of them are done right now, or not done. They've all kind of been part of it. I think he's talking about the movement as far as you can see. The first parable puts an idea out there, and the second parable expands that idea, and the third one further expands it. So that's what he's talking about is, yeah, it's a conceptual expansion, not a chronological expansion, if that makes sense.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
It does, actually.
Okay.
Here you go.
Sir? It's not so much a question, it's just an observation. So I was watching you and looking at your watch. And I was thinking in relation to, you know, a householder that has a treasure. And let's say it's somebody that collects watches. And
Mhm.
I've got a 200-year-old wristwatch, you know, that is a treasure to me because I appreciate, you know, how old it is and the intricacies of its working and all that. It has value to me. And that is a marvel of technology, you know, your
Mhm.
iWatch. And
Yeah.
so I've got this old thing and this new thing, and they both have, you know, a very great value to me. You know, and their importance and their worth and all of that. And
Yeah.
it seems like he's kind of saying that, you know, the old covenant is still valuable and has favor in God's eyes, just as the new does. So it's not like you don't need to just throw that out
Hmm.
and trade it in for the new. They both have value. I guess that's
You know, I
what
actually,
was
I
occurring to me as you were saying that.
I like, I mean, I like what you're going, is that those are both valuable.
Right.
And in this case, it's not only the one or the other, that there's, that's kind of what I was getting at with both of those. You've got the Jews and you've got the Gentiles, and there's going to be this sort of mixing, not the method of faith. The method of salvation is always faith. The old covenant no longer exists,
Right.
but the Jews still have an identity, they still have things. And so I do think, and both of those are value. And in fact, if you looked at it as people of value, going back to the treasure and the pearl of great price, Israel is his people, they're his covenant people. So there's a value there. But now you've also got this new group that is now those who put their faith in Jesus as the Messiah, Jews and Gentiles, this group. So you've got two valuable treasures, and one of them is old from a situation that it's been his chosen people since, about 2000 BC, and another one that is just newly going to be coming onto the spot, onto the scene.
Right.
Yeah. No, I like that. That's had not thought about that. It's good. Okay. Yeah. All right. So let's go on now to sort of wrapping this up. So Rich, this is kind of going back to what you were saying with looking at the flow of the thought of how it sort of expands as we take it there. So he starts out with the sower, which is basically saying, hey, look, this this gospel, this new truth, right, that's going to be out there, the belief in the Messiah, and particularly in the death and resurrection of the Messiah, this gospel is going to be sown all throughout the world, right? And it's going to encounter 4 different types of responses. So there's going to be a gospel spreading. Then a second one is that when that gospel spreads, when the seed actually does take root, it doesn't fall on the hard soil, but it falls on one of the other 3, that the power of regenerative life does not come from the sower, the person that spreads the gospel, and it doesn't come from the soil in which the seed falls, but the seed itself, from within itself, life grows. It's inexplicable in how that life-giving force is. And of course, we talked about the fact that that's through the Holy Spirit. But his point there is that this isn't going to be something that you and I as individuals, you can't earn your salvation. You can't do anything to create that life. The life inexplicably grows once that seed of the gospel is planted in soil that is receptive to it. And then he's going to say, okay, great. Now that there's going to be seeds that are sown and there's going to be now plants that are growing up, the enemy is going to come and he's also going to sow a gospel. He's also going to be throwing out the seed. In this case, it's the seed of the tares. And it's going to, remember, a lot of times the wheat and the tares look the same initially. It's only when they start to grow that you can tell the difference between the plant. And so in a very similar way, this false message that's going to be dressed up as Christianity, that's going to be dressed up as biblical, there may be some truth to it. It'll look in some way similar to the truth, but in the end, when its fruits are shown, it'll show itself to be a tare, not a wheat, right? But they're all going to grow up together, and this process is going to continue until the Messianic kingdom. In other words, what we talked about is that God isn't going to say, oh, there's a tare and he's going to rip it out now, and there's a tare and he's going to rip it out now. There's going to be this false religious belief, this false Christian doctrine that he's going to allow to continue to go side by side with the true gospel up until the Messianic kingdom, right? And then he's going to say, now that the seed is been spread and is starting to grow, and now we've got tares growing up with it, now what you're going to see is you're going to see the enormity of the growth of this thing now called Christianity, made up of both the wheat and the tares, right? Because they both claim the name of Christ. This thing is going to grow to massive proportions. And that was his whole point in taking a very tiny seed that, for the size that it is, you wouldn't expect the plant to be very big, but it comes from this very, very tiny seed, and then it grows up to be this monstrous plant. And that's what he's saying, is that the seed starts out extremely small, but by the time this thing is done, it's going to grow big, and it's going to allow the birds to nest in it. Remember, the birds from the first parable was Satan, right? And his angels, right? His demons. So that in this mustard tree, there's going to be good and bad, and Satan is going to have a place in Christendom as he tries to promote this false gospel. And then we talked about the parable of the leaven. So Jesus is going to say, you know, it's going to grow, there's going to be the tares. Now but the idea then is this false doctrine now is going to spread just like leaven spreads throughout the dough, right? And when it starts to spread, it just keeps on spreading, right? And he talked about the fact that it was going to be there's going to be 3 components, which we discussed was the Roman Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy, and Protestantism as those 3 pillars of Christianity. And within each of them, there is doctrinal error, heresies, right? In fact, many of the cults come from not from Roman Catholicism or Eastern Orthodoxy. They come from Protestantism, right? So,
What are some examples of that?
Jehovah's Witness, Mormons, Jim Jones, Camp Davidian, yeah, just some real recent examples of that. I could talk about TV preachers, and I'm not talking about all of them. I'm talking about there's some that are clearly, without naming names, clearly teaching heresy.
Like churches?
Oh, yes, yes, and that's all. And again, most of that's within Protestantism. It's only Roman Catholicism now that's starting to come around on that topic too. So that's a Protestant heresy, or Protestant doctrinal confusion. And then he's basically talking about like now this big tree, this whole thing, it's going to be monstrous. We've got this leaven, which is representative of this sin, and basically we talked about it specifically in this case, it's doctrinal orthodoxy that's going to be at stake here. And then now he goes into the fact that okay, we've got this thing going on, but now who's this going to be made up of? Right? We know there's wheat and tares. So no, we know there's good and bad people, essentially. Like there's the righteous and the unrighteous. We know that those are hold to doctrinal orthodoxy and those that don't hold to doctrinal orthodoxy. But we don't know the groups now. Like who's going to be composed of this? And up until now, it's Jews. And remember, Jews were God's people. The Gentiles were looked at as really forsaken, particularly by the Jews. There's very few Gentiles that got to kind of come into the Jewish culture and to adapt to that were sort of accepted. So now Jesus has got to say, look, it's not just that there's righteous and unrighteous. It's not just Jews, but this thing's now going to be composed of, in this case, the hidden treasure, Jews that are going to put their faith and trust, the pearl of great price, those Gentiles that come out of the sea that are also going to be believers. So now this kingdom will involve those. And then again, the net here is about specifically around those Gentiles, and they're going to be judged. Now we're going to kind of refer back to this a little bit when we get to the end of Matthew. So I'm going to save that piece until we get there. But this whole idea of this net is around the righteous and the unrighteous Gentiles. Some will get to participate in the kingdom. And some will not. They're going to be burned up or thrown away, right? And then we've got, again, that householder, which we just talked about, that within that, there's going to be within that household, there's going to be this old and new, however we interpret that old and new, that there's going to be, and that's part of what contributes to the mystery of the kingdom. Because whether you looked at it sort of what Arnold said, or maybe the perspective I had, both of those are things that will cause mystery because they were unknown. This idea of this old and new put together in some new entity was not known. So that is where we leave tonight. Let me ask if there's any questions about what I've covered before we end. Yeah, do you want to get him the...
Again, not so much a question, but looking at that page right there, it's just mind blowing. After, a lifetime of reading those verses, and just going, oh, that's nice. That's nice. And seeing the organization and the story that's being told in them, it's just like, wow.
Yeah.
It's
Well,
amazing.
And that was kind of the point I was making earlier, which is if you just kind of read the little snippet, it's like, Jesus is talking about some guy finds a treasure in a field, and it's like, okay, I mean, I get it. Some guy finds a treasure in a field and he spends all he has to buy the field so he can get the treasure. Like, it's all nice, but it'd be easy just to sort of read past that and be like, I'm not sure what he's trying to convey. Let me get to something that I understand. Oh, now they're going to be in a boat and there's going to be a storm. I get that. Like that's going to be next week. I get that. I can relate to that. But this other stuff is more, feels almost like a proverbial, like Proverbs, like, some just sort of like, what's the connection? Because he's obviously sitting down. He's trying to teach him something. And so you're right. It's when you put that all together within the context of being rejected and now a new mystery kingdom, now it actually starts to make sense what he's trying to convey.
He's sitting down and he's speaking to them. And, at some point, Holy Spirit inspires, the apostles to write the Gospels. But there's no way at what point did they put this together? Because they wouldn't have known about the mystery kingdom for quite some, didn't it? It had to be studied and revealed bit by bit to them as they understood more and more as they reflected upon what they were hearing
Sure.
Jesus say. Even after his death, they had to they must have spent time pondering
Yeah.
these
Yeah,
parables and
yeah.
their meaning.
Well, and even like, again, they didn't even really start to grasp that until the 40 days after his resurrection and then his ascension, when now he's gone. And now we're supposed to take over for this whole thing. But you're right. You see in the writings of Paul where Paul had to go through that process. And we find out, if you're talking about a timing perspective, you're talking somewhere around 90 AD, where the Apostle John gets that final revelation. And in that final revelation, the revelation of Jesus Christ, at the very end, where he adds a whole bunch of stuff that hadn't been revealed, and then you look back and go, oh, now so it wasn't even until John in 90 AD that you start to put all the pieces together and you really understand that mystery kingdom. So it was absolutely a learning process of what are we going to do with this.
And this reminds me, as Paul was writing in Philippians, we're talking about treasures and the treasures, the pearls, and the field, the treasures. Yet Paul considered his everything a loss.
Yeah.
He's lost everything. Everything is rubbish compared to his knowing Christ, Jesus, and understanding that he was righteous through God's gift of grace and faith and not through the law. I mean, that just seems to when it clicks.
Yeah, you remember Acts 10, Cornelius, right?
Yeah.
And Peter's Peter's sitting there on the top of the roof of his house, and God, gives him this whole thing of the food that comes down, and he's told, like, eat this food that's not, it's not kosher and stuff, representing the Gentiles. And he's told, you got to go to Cornelius. What does Peter want to do?
Eat by himself.
Peter just, no.
He didn't want to go.
He
period.
refuses. He's just like Jonah, because so even at this point here, where you've got Peter after the ascension, Peter is now the prominent, one of the prominent people in the church, and now God's telling him to go, what he thinks is desecrate himself by bringing this to the Gentiles. What do the Gentiles have to do with it? Like, the Jews are God's chosen people. You really want me to go to those? Like, do you know what? Anyway, so my point is that you see even through the book of Acts and through the epistles all the way up through John, how the vision the mystery starts to be unraveled a little bit. But that's why it's called a mystery, because they've got to wrestle with a whole bunch of stuff that was never, ever foretold in the Old Testament. Yeah, go ahead.
Just an observation about the third one, the tares.
Yeah.
And the workers that wanted to go out and pull them apart, catch and in the process uprooting some of the good. You find a very similar situation in a lot of churches today.
Yeah.
Where there's a us for no more, and if you're outside of that thought, stay outside. Rather than the gospel being for everyone, and we accept those individuals that come our way, and we watch God bring about the process of regeneration in their life.
Yeah, and you can even look at this from a church history perspective. You take a look at church history after the Protestant Reformation, where if you were like an Anabaptist compared to a Reformed theology, there were wars against Christians when they tried to, quote, uproot what they thought was incorrect theology, and they were murdered, and they were burned at the stake and everything else as heretics. So there's a lot of other things where maybe a desire to root stuff up, even though those aren't tares in this case, still you can destroy the good. So very interesting. All right, well, thank you, everyone. Appreciate it. We will see you next week. Again, next week is going to be a very familiar story. If you like being seasick out on the sea in big storms and seeing what Christ does, then come back next week, because again, now he's done with the parables. It's only been a few minutes or an hour. The time that it's taken between his rejection and the end of these parables is almost no time has collapsed. Now you're going to start to see, what does his ministry look like after this? Now you're going to see him change in some stuff. And so we're going to start looking at that and pointing that out along the way. But next week, we look forward to that. So until then, thank you, everybody.
Will you be talking about the parable of the two brothers, the prodigal son?
Oh, yeah, let me go ahead and hit stop on the record, and then I'll be happy to answer that as an offline, yeah, offline here. And let me just see here. Hold on, let me just stop the recording. Okay, stop.